What is the difference between total float and free float? Critical path analysis is a project management technique that helps identify the critical tasks and the amount of time required to complete them. Two important concepts in critical path analysis are total float and free float. Total float. Total float is the amount of time that a schedule activity can be delayed or extended from its early start date without delaying the project finish date or violating a schedule constraint. In other words, total float for any activity is defined as the difference between its latest start date and earliest start date. In a network diagram, total float of the critical path is 0. Total float can be calculated by subtracting the early start date of activity from its late start date or early finish date from its late finish date. Total float, LS, ES. Total float, LF, EF. Note that the total float is also known as the slack. Free float. Free float is the amount of time that a schedule activity can be delayed without delaying the early start date of any successor or violating a schedule constraint. Simply, we can say that free float is the amount of time that an activity can be delayed without delaying the early start date of its successor. Different than TF, which is calculated at the path level, free float is calculated at the activity level. Free float, ES, of successors, EF of current activity minus 1. Example. Assume that we made forward and backward pass calculation and determined the critical path of the below network diagram. The critical path is ACE path because it has the longest duration, hence the total float of this path is 0. Which activities can have free float? Activity B has two successors, which are activity C and activity D. If there is a delay in activity B, it delays the activity D, so activity B has no free float. Free float for activity D. FF, ES, of successors, EF of current activity minus 1. FF, ES, of activity E, EF of activity D minus 1. FF, 19 to 11 minus 1 is equal to 7. Free float for activity D is 7. Activity D can be delayed 7 days without delaying the early start date of activity E. Know your float. In project management, float is the number of days you can delay a task without causing problems with the following tasks or the total completion date of the project. Sometimes referred to as slack, float connects with project scheduling, schedule network diagrams, and the critical path of a project. Each has a corresponding formula, and the project managers must understand how each works in support of scheduling work. Free float is how much time is available in the schedule without risk before impacting other project activities. Total float is the amount of time a schedule activity can be delayed or extended from its early start date without delaying the project finish date or violating a schedule constraint.